Thank you, CJ and TJ. Those were good questions, and of course, those were good answers. We appreciate these guys stepping up to the plate to help us out. One more question tonight. What parts of the Old Testament are still applicable today, considering Matthew 5 and verse 17? Matthew 5 and verse 17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So some people say, well, he did not come to abolish the law, therefore some of the law must still be in effect. And it's really not accurate. The short answer to the question is none of the Old Testament is still binding on us today. That is, none of the terms of the Old Covenant are terms that you and I are responsible for keeping today. And I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, well, whoa, preacher, you know, you got 9 out of those 10 commandments that are carried forward. Sometimes you'll hear that expression. And the reality is that's not true. That's not true. All of the 10 commandments, together with the other 600 and some odd commandments of the old law, were all nailed to the cross. Now, we'll talk about those 9 commandments later on, okay? But for right now, let's just keep it simple and say none of the terms of the Old Covenant are still applicable today. None of them. I know there are people that are called Sabbatarians. Those are individuals that believe that the Sabbath law still is binding today, and they try to make an artificial distinction in the Old Testament between moral law and ceremonial law. And they will say, well, all of the moral laws were brought forward, but not the ceremonial laws. I can just tell you that's an artificial distinction. The Bible does not make that distinction. The Bible speaks in terms of an old covenant and a new covenant. And what we find is that the old covenant was a covenant between God and the physical nation of Israel. Are you a part of that nation? The answer is no. We are not part of the physical nation of Israel. But you can read about that, Exodus chapter 19 and verse 4. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak, Moses, to the people of Israel. And so Moses came and he called the elders of the people, and he set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Now, you see that covenant language there between God and the physical nation of Israel. Fast forward just a few chapters to Exodus chapter 24 and verse 7. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. We will be obedient. And Moses then took the blood, he threw it upon the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you according to all of these words. That is, the blood of these animals ratified that covenant, the old covenant between God and the people of Israel. But again, that covenant was made with the physical nation of Israel. It was not made with anybody else, not then, not now. It is no longer in force. Galatians chapter 3 and verse 24, Paul writes, the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. We are no longer subject to the terms of that old covenant. Colossians 2 and verse 14 simply says it was nailed to the cross. Not part of it. The covenant was nailed to the cross. Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 7. If the first covenant, you and I call that the Old Testament, if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. But he finds fault with them, that is, with the old covenant. God finds fault with the covenant that he made. Yes, it's what engineers call engineered obsolescence. God designed the Old Testament to have a fault built into it. And finding fault with it, we'll talk about what that is in just a second. Finding fault with them, that is, with the Old Covenant. Behold, then, the days are coming, says the Lord. And this goes back to a quotation from Jeremiah, who's prophesying of a new covenant to come. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And then skipping down to verse 13, and speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. The old covenant is obsolete. It is not destroyed. When you're looking at the language in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, it is not destroyed. That's the language that the King James and a few others uses. Some of your other modern translations use the word abolish. That word comes from a Greek word that means to disintegrate or to demolish. Jesus did not come to blow up the Old Testament. He didn't come to demolish it, to disintegrate it, to make it useless. The Old Testament, the Old Covenant still serves a purpose. We have preached sermons on that from this podium, why the Old Testament still matters. And I'm not going to re-preach one of those sermons. I'll just point you to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11. This would illustrate the point, where Paul says that these things, and he's been using Old Testament examples there in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. In verse 11, he says, these things happened to them as an example. They were written down for our instruction, on whom the ends of the ages have come. So no, Jesus did not come to blow it up, to destroy the old covenant. But he did come, as he says, to fulfill it. Jesus completed the primary purpose of the law, which was to lead us to him. Again, what did Galatians chapter 3 say? It was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, a guardian to bring us to Christ. In Luke chapter 24, when those two guys were on the road to Emmaus, remember, after the resurrection of Jesus, and Jesus speaks with them in verse 27 of Luke chapter 24, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus interpreted to them in all of the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures, the Old Covenant. He interpreted to them, those scriptures, the things concerning himself. And he had a lot of material in the Old Testament to work from. Hundreds of messianic prophecies, beginning from Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, when God said, I will put enmity between you, Satan, and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He, Jesus, the offspring of the woman, the Messiah, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. The first messianic prophecy, but it's the first of many in the Old Testament, all the way down to the last chapter of the Old Testament, Malachi chapter 4, and in verse 2, for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings. Undoubtedly a messianic prophecy of the work of Jesus. Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament sacrifices with his one sacrifice. He fulfilled the Old Testament high priesthood with his own high priesthood. He fulfilled the ceremonial laws of purity by making it possible for you and for me, those of us who are Christians, to have true holiness and righteousness made possible by his sacrifice and the forgiveness that it offers. The temple worship is fulfilled in you and in me because we are God's temple, his dwelling place today. The book of Romans is a masterpiece to describe the contrast between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And in the book of Romans, it's all about the method of justification. Because in the Old Covenant, the method was very straightforward. Do it all. You want to be right with God living under the Old Covenant? Just do it perfectly. Never sin and you will be fine. Well, of course, that's a problem, right? Because, as the book of Romans says, we have all sinned and come short of the glory of God. It is a system that is problematic. A system by which, as Peter told the audience there in Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem conference, neither we nor our fathers have been able to do it. Peter says that old covenant is not a covenant that anyone was successful in doing. In the new covenant, the New Testament, it's a wholly different system. In the new covenant, the system is forgiveness. Forgiveness by the blood of Christ in our humble, faithful, submissive response to what he's done for us. When Jesus says you cannot put new wine into old wineskins, that's exactly what he's talking about. You cannot take this new covenant system and try to force it onto that old covenant system. Those are two very different systems of justification. And so to answer the question, what parts of the Old Testament are still applicable today? None of them. They were all nailed to the cross, all of them. The new covenant replaced the old covenant. So let's go back to the question that I know you have. What about those 9 commandments, you know? Were they carried forward in the new covenant? No. No. Like all the rest of the old covenant, they were nailed to the cross. But the two covenants do share many of the same principles, many of the same instructions, many of the same commandments. It's not a carrying forward of those things. It's simply a restatement of principles that are eternally true. And so, we're not talking about numeric commandments here. We're talking about qualitative numbers. And so we're not talking about we'll pick this one and this one and this one, but not this one and this one and this one. That's not how it works. It's all done away with. The new covenant is qualitatively more than the old covenant. Whereas the old covenant, you want to talk about those other 9 commandments? Thou shalt not commit adultery. How did Jesus address that? Well, of course, it's still sinful to commit adultery, right? The 7th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. But Jesus says, well, yeah, but you're not supposed to even lust after a woman. He says, when you do that, you've committed adultery with her already in your heart. See the difference? Jesus qualitatively improves on the old covenant. How about the 6th commandment? Thou shalt not murder. Well, is it okay to murder today? Because after all, that was nailed to the cross. No. Jesus says, of course, you're not supposed to murder. But more than that, you're not to hate an individual. And so we could go on and on looking at numerous examples of how the new covenant and the commands that are a part of the new covenant are qualitatively superior to the commands of the old covenant. The book of Hebrews is all about that. 11 times in the book of Hebrews, the record says that the new is better. It's better. A better priesthood, better promises, and twice he says it's a better covenant. I don't know about you, but I am thankful to God that I live under a better covenant than the old covenant. I hope that these were edifying to you. Again, we so appreciate the questions that have been submitted. And again, I'll tell you, as far as numbers go, these 2 guys who preached tonight, I didn't give them the questions. I said, here's 2 pages of questions that we have. You choose. A couple of these questions date back to 2025. So if yours has not been addressed yet, please be patient. We have 2 pages of questions that we're trying to work through. But thanks to all of you who submit those questions. As always, if you're subject to the Lord's invitation, we'll have an invitation song at this time. It's a convenient time. It's all it is, an expedient, convenient time for you to respond to heaven's invitation. If you need to do that, we encourage you to come now while we stand and sing.